Greetings to everyone. Portion for today's reading is Exodus 22 to 24. In Exodus 22, it continues the detailed laws God gives to Israel through Moses. These laws focus on justice in everyday life, especially concerning property, social responsibility, and moral integrity. If someone steals, they must repay multiple times over. If damage is caused, whether by negligence or intent, restoration is required. There are also laws about safeguarding borrowed items and treating strangers, widows, and orphans with compassion. God warns strongly against exploiting the vulnerable, reminding Israel that He hears their cry. The chapter also includes commands against idolatry, sorcery, and immoral practices, along with instructions to honor God with offerings and live as a holy people. At its core, this chapter reveals that God's justice is not abstract, it is deeply relational. Sin is not just against God, but also against neighbors. Restoration is emphasized more than punishment, showing that God's heart for reconciliation. The repeated concern for the weak reflects God's own character. He is a defender of the helpless. The law about honesty and responsibility points to a life of integrity before God. Holiness here is not limited to worship, it extends into daily conduct. God is shaping a people who reflect His righteousness in every sphere of life. Today, Exodus 22 challenges us to live responsibly and compassionately in society. It calls us to take accountability for our actions, whether in finances, relationships, or work. It reminds us to protect and care for the vulnerable, those who cannot repay us or defend themselves. In a world driven by self interest, God's standards call us to fairness, honesty, and generosity. It also urges us to examine hidden forms of exploitation, whether economic, emotional, or social, and align our lives with God's justice. In Exodus 23, this chapter continues laws but shifts towards justice in community life. False testimony is strictly forbidden, and justice must not be perverted, even for the sake of the poor or the powerful. People are instructed to help even their enemies, such as returning a stray animal. The Sabbath law is enforced, not only for people but also for servants and animals. God establishes three major annual festivals: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering. Towards the end, God promises to send an angel before Israel to guide them into the Promised Land, warning them to obey Him fully and avoid the influence of pagan nations. This chapter reveals that righteousness includes truthfulness, mercy, and impartiality. Helping an enemy reflects God's grace. He causes people to rise above natural human tendencies. The Sabbath principle shows God's care for rest, balance, and dignity for all creation. The festival reminds Israel to live in gratitude and remembrance of God's provision. The promise of God's guiding angel points to His constant presence and leadership, but also demands obedience. Blessings and guidance are tied to faithfulness. Exodus 23 speaks powerfully into modern life, where truth is often compromised. It challenges us to stand for truth, even when it is inconvenient. It calls us to practice kindness beyond boundaries, even towards those who oppose us. The Sabbath principle reminds us in today's fast paced world to value rest and spiritual renewal. The festival teaches us to cultivate gratitude instead of entitlement. And finally, it reminds us that God still leads His people, but we must be willing to follow His voice wholeheartedly. In Exodus 24, this chapter marks a significant moment: the formal covenant between God and Israel. Moses, Aaron, and the elders are invited to worship God from a distance, while Moses alone approaches Him closely. Moses writes down God's laws and reads them to the people, who respond in unity. "We will do everything the Lord has said." The covenant is then sealed with blood, half on the altar and half on the people, symbolizing a binding agreement. Moses then ascends Mount Sinai, where he remains for 40 days and nights in the presence of God. Exodus 24 highlights the seriousness of covenant relationship with God. The shedding of blood signifies commitment, sacrifice, and consecration. It foreshadows the ultimate covenant through Christ. The people's response shows willingness, but also reveals human limitation, as later events show their failure. Moses' ascent represents deeper intimacy with God, showing that while all are invited to relationship, deeper communion requires surrender and total obedience. God's glory on the mountain emphasizes His holiness and majesty. This chapter reminds us that our relationship with God is covenantal, not casual. It calls for commitment, obedience, and reverence. The idea of covenant challenges today's tendency towards temporary faith or convenience based devotion. It also reminds us of the cost of relationship. True devotion involves sacrifice. Moses' time on the mountain encourages us to seek deeper intimacy with God in a distracted world. God still invites us closer, but we must respond intentionally. Points to ponder. Am I living a faith that reflects God's justice and compassion in my daily actions? Do I treat my relationship with God as a covenant commitment or just a convenience? May God bless you all. Amen.